Logan Crawford, and this is The Right Way, a video podcast where I speak with the world's most compelling writers. Today, I am talking to the great American political pontificator himself. He is preeminent as well. I'd like to get as much alliteration in there as possible since this is a literate type show. He is the man behind a book called The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids. Let's say hello to Rich Rubino. Rich, how you doing today?
Doing well, Logan. Thank you so much for having me on again.
My pleasure. Great to see you here on The Right Way. Your book is awesome. It's like an encyclopedia. It's about that thick. What's it, about 500 or 600 pages?
500 pages.
500 pages. And tell me about the writing process. It must have taken you, I would think, years to compile this information, right?
Yeah, it took a couple of years, but so much of it, because I'm kind of a congenital C-SPAN junkie, is stuff that I kind of knew in the back of my head, and I was trying to find ways to verify it. So it's a matter of going to try to say, where did I find this? And sometimes you'll find stuff, and you'll find that either it's not true, it's sort of true, or you'll find it's true, then you'll find 7 or 8 other things from that time period. I really love going to contemporaneous sources. I like going to the primary sources from that time where you can actually read the articles. And sometimes it's funny, you'll find stuff like, for example, there was a quote that I was looking for Everett Dirksen, the former Senate Minority Leader from Illinois, supposedly said $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about some real money. So I looked it up and I found out that he never said that. And it was actually somebody sat next to him on an airplane and said, I just want to say that was such a great quote you had. Dirksen looked at him and said, oh no, son, I never actually said that. It was just such a darn good quote, I never bothered to deny it. So you find that all the time as well.
Exactly. And a lot of it has to do with the media. I mean, I will go to an event that's covered by print media and covered by video media, and you would not believe it is the same event because the print people are writing their impressions and writing quotes as they hear them, and it's a lot different than what is actually said often.
Well, it's interesting too, because if you're watching a report, remember, they may seem longer, but most news reports, most packages are only about 1.5 minutes. And so sometimes you just get a very small soundbite. You get maybe 15 seconds of, if there's a speech, the actual speaker, then you get maybe 15 seconds of somebody in the audience talking, and then you get a bridge with the anchors talking for about 15 seconds. So you get very little of what the actual speech is. And, while everyone perhaps tries to be unbiased, you, in a sense, when you're choosing what 15 seconds of the speech that you're going to put in, you're showing some sort of a bias. So it's really kind of an impossible thing to actually achieve. But obviously, it shows just how much power people in the media have, because they'll say, out of a 1-hour speech, they'll say, this 15 seconds is what I'm going to choose. And oftentimes they want to choose what's the most sensational. They're not going to be choosing what he's talking about his position on the line on a veto, because it's just not that sexy or interesting.
Exactly. We're lucky we live in this digital age, though, because you can watch the whole speech online if you care to.
Yep.
People of your own political standing look at that entire speech and are picking out different sound bites. So it's a very democratic age when it comes to media, I think. What about you?
Yes, absolutely. But I think the danger of it is that we tend to go into our own echo chambers. It's human instinct. There was a time when everyone got their news from Huntley and Brinkley, or they got their news from Walter Cronkite. Now people are getting their news from sources that they agree with. It's kind of this gravitational pull, right? You go toward people that you agree with, and then you kind of can talk to other people that you agree with, and can say, this is what I've heard on the news. And then you can go after. Sometimes people will go just because it's kind of like an affinity group. The conservatives will go to One America, liberals will go to something like Democracy Now, and then kind of center left people will go to CNN, center right will go to Fox, and it's even within the ideologies now. It's interesting because so CNN and MSNBC are kind of seen as almost for left and center left, and then you have people on the far left. They'll go to somewhere like Democracy Now, maybe Rubino, Chomsky. On the conservative side, you can have the center right going to somewhere like Fox News, and now there are other outlets on the far right, like One America or Newsmask, where people can essentially go. So within those ideologies, the problem is you're getting information that's going to be skewed a certain way to try to agree, from a marketing standpoint. It's interesting if you actually go back in time, because I remember when Fox News began and when MSNBC began. When Fox News began, it wasn't nearly as ideological as it is today. When MSNBC began, it wasn't nearly as ideological as it was today. I remember you could watch, for example, Special Report at 6 o'clock, and it was generally pretty unbiased. Even on MSNBC, even when Keith Olbermann had his first show, It was as unbiased as generally unbiased. Then, of course, the marketing comes in, and Fox goes to the right, MSNBC goes to the left. There's always kind of a perilous nature in that.
Absolutely. And if you think of it, Hannity used to have a co-host who was Alan Colmes. So you got the right and you got the left, and then you could decide. Remember, their motto used to be, we report, you decide. But what it's all about is viewers, clicks, subscribers, and followers. And you're only going to get those viewers, clicks, subscribers, and followers, unfortunately, in this era, if you advocate one side. Few people cheer for moderation, is what I often say. So if I am to say something very explosive today that is either on the far right or the far left, that soundbite might get picked up by someone. And I might get viewers and followers and likes and comments. And that's what feeds this beast. So it almost needs to be reinvented again.
It's interesting. The moderates didn't storm the Bastille. I've never heard of moderates. You never hear of moderates rioting, right? You never hear of moderates overturning cars, but you do hear of people on the extremes doing that. And moderates, frankly, can be somewhat boring.
Exactly.
It's boring to cover moderates. I remember when Al Gore ran for president in 1988, he called himself a raging moderate. Bruce Babbitt tried to do the same thing back then, but moderates don't necessarily resonate. And that's why you hear all the time people say, I don't like the Democrats, I don't like the Republicans. Why isn't there a more moderate voice? And part of it is, I think, just the fact that moderates just frankly can be boring, and they don't necessarily. Also, the other thing moderates don't have is they're not necessarily base type candidates, meaning they're not people that you would necessarily die for. They're more people they're more a candidate that people would say, oh, well, I'm for this candidate because I don't like this candidate, don't like that candidate. Therefore, they don't necessarily have this huge, this groundswell of support behind them. They're kind of a default candidate, and that's sometimes what hurts moderates, I think.
Right. And if there ever was a strong default candidate, I would think it would have to be Joe Biden. I think, in my opinion, he was largely elected because a lot of people did not like Donald Trump. A lot of people liked Donald Trump and they voted. A lot of people didn't like Donald Trump and wanted any alternative, and they voted also. Do you agree?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Here's the thing with Joe Biden. In 2020, and part of the reason why his job approval is, about 39, 38% right now, he was never a base candidate. If you asked who the Democratic base supported, it was probably either Elizabeth Warren or it was Bernie Sanders, maybe some Tulsi Gabbard. But Joe Biden was more or less picked by the establishment of the party. If you remember, he lost miserably in Iowa, he lost in New Hampshire, and then he left New Hampshire before he could even give his concession speech. He was just down to South Carolina because South Carolina was his last stand. Then Congressman John Clyburn, very influential, the majority whip right now from South Carolina, says he's going to endorse Joe Biden. Then a lot of other elected officials gravitate toward Joe Biden in many respects because they saw the polls and they saw that Joe Biden had the best chance of defeating Donald Trump in the general election. They did not want somebody that was their ideological soulmate, though even some people on the left, like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, they wanted somebody who could upend Donald Trump. And you see this sometimes after when you see a very polarizing president, for example. Now, sometimes the Democrats, just like the Republicans, 1964, they nominated Barry Goldwater, someone on the right who said extremism, offensive liberty is no vice. He wins 6 states in the general election. 4 years later, they nominate Richard Nixon, seen as a moderate. 1972, Democrats nominate George McGovern. He wins 1 state, Massachusetts, and the District of Columbia. 1976, they go back and nominate Jimmy Carter, someone more for the center. And so what's happened in terms of Joe Biden, it's just like, I'll give one more analogy. Bill Clinton in 1992, part of the reason he won the Democratic primary over more liberal candidates like Jerry Brown and Tom Harkin was because he was seen as a Southern moderate, and he was seen as somebody who could win in the general election, and the party had been out of power for 12 years. I think very similar to what they saw with Joe Biden. Didn't matter where he stood on the issues. It was just the fact that he was not Donald Trump.
Exactly. No, I agree 100%. And the strategy of locking away Joe in the basement was very effective because people didn't know what he was all about. They construed him to be whatever he was. They thought of Joe Biden from 2008 or 2012. Joe Biden from 2020 is a very different man. I mean, I barely recognized the man by his speech pattern, his rhetoric, his physical appearance. He is very much diminished. What are your thoughts on Joe Biden as we go forward in these last 2 years of his presidency?
Very ironic. First of all, he was first elected the same day Richard Nixon was reelected. to the United States Senate in 1972 when he was literally not 30 years old. 30 years old, the constitutional requirement permissible to serve in the Senate, but his birthday came between the election and between the election and his inauguration. So he was seen as he was the youngest member of the United States Senate. He was seen as very much a kid, and as soon as he got elected, because he just defeated an incumbent Republican senator who very few people thought he could actually defeat. As soon as he got elected, he kind of was seen as the kid, and he was already propelled as a potential presidential candidate. 1987 was probably really his year. That was the year when he first declared his presidential candidacy. And then it turned out that he had basically purloined certain speeches from Neil Kinnock, a Labor Party leader. And then John Sasso, who worked for Mike Dukakis, leaked this to the media. Dukakis then fired him. But that was probably really his year. If you listen to speeches of him in the 80s, the 90s, even if he gives, a graduation speech, when he gives nonpartisan speeches, he was pretty charismatic.
Absolutely.
Now, if the 1988 Joe Biden, listen to any speech when he's when he's in New Hampshire, when he's in Iowa, very charismatic. Some people wanted him to run in 2004 because they're afraid John Kerry was going to get the nomination. I didn't think he was charismatic enough. They thought Joe Biden was a lot more charismatic, and he chose not to at the last minute. 2007, he declares a presidential candidacy. The problem with his 2007-2008 candidacy is America, the Democratic Party wanted somebody from outside of politics, and Joe Biden had been chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and only in politics, the more time you spend in politics, it actually lands up being perilous toward you, and actually lands up having deleterious effects. People say, oh, he's been in office for too long. So his presidential candidacy did not resonate. He garners about 1.8% of the vote, drops out. Then Barack Obama chooses him as his vice presidential running mate, gives him legs. And by 2016, partly because of his name recognition and because polls show that he could appeal to a lot of blue collar voters that other candidates couldn't, he lands up winning the nomination, and then he lands up winning the presidency. But I will say, I don't think that he's nearly as infirm as a lot of people do make him out to be. He still is essentially working, and he still is going out, and he's, every time you hear about the gaffes, the fact of the matter is he still is making those trips, and he still is meeting with these foreign leaders. He still is trying to get legislation passed. He's still trying to deal with Joe Manchin every day. So I think that you can be hyperbolic in terms of how infirm he is, but he's certainly not this Joe Biden of 2008, or even, certainly the one in 1988, who was extremely charismatic.
I've got a question. I think a lot of Americans have this question. Do you think the president of the United States, no matter who it is truly in charge? Or do you think there are power brokers behind the scene, political bosses, entrenched bureaucracy that are actually running the show?
I don't think that it's as pronounced as a lot of people think it is. I don't think that there's this, Martinet and this saying, Joe Biden, go over here. You're going to go to Mississippi today. No, I don't think it works like that. Now, that being said, there is certainly a power structure, and there certainly is an infrastructure of people that mostly the pharmaceutical industry, corporations, unions for the Democrats, corporations certainly for both sides now, places like Goldman Sachs, Big Pharma, that certainly are in control of legislation. And sometimes you'll see them they'll have representatives or lobbyists, if you will, literally writing legislation that gets through. And it's true that they do have certainly an effect. And obviously, if you're getting money from Goldman Sachs, if you're getting money from certain corporations, you don't necessarily want to kind of disown them, because for your political purposes, it's certainly not necessarily going to help. So I do think that there is a power structure that essentially is not really in charge, but it's certainly, shall we say, it helps along the process. It's coefficient. It's working with that person in office. And I think that obviously it's lobbying groups, but sometimes the president will make decisions, regardless of what other people are telling him. I mean, if Bill Clinton sending troops into Bosnia before the 1996 election, for example, not a very popular decision, but he still made that decision. And also, I will say that in terms of, if you are wondering who actually is perhaps making decisions for the president, for the Joe Biden's decision, Joe Biden's case, you could say someone like maybe Doug Schoen, the chief of staff, something like someone to that effect. But they do kind of have political advisors, and the political advisors will try to position them and say, this is what you have to do. This is what our polling says. You need to emphasize this issue. If you emphasize this issue, people aren't going to care, or this could hurt you with this constituency. But generally, in terms of the executive branch, the president is essentially calling the shots. But I will say, when you say is the president in charge, there still are two other branches of government, And as Joe Biden is certainly finding out, in the United States House of Representatives, he has a very de minimis majority. And in the United States Senate, he has a 1-vote majority with Joe Manchin very much pulling the strings. So I guess you could make the case that Joe Manchin is really kind of certainly the most powerful person who is not a president in the United States Congress. And you need 60 votes sometimes in order to break off a filibuster. So, Joe Biden he does not have plenipotentiary powers to just wave his hand and get legislation passed or to ameliorate this problem or that problem. There are very much checks and balances in the system in terms of lobbyists and presidents, and in terms of presidents in the other 2 branches of government.
You've kind of hinted at it. Let's talk about the midterm elections that are coming up. Are we going to see a big shift here? What are your thoughts, Rich?
Historically, on the first midterm election, the party in power loses about 39 seats in the House of Representatives. Generally, they do lose seats. Part of that is because there's a buyer's remorse on the part of the party in power. The other part is there's always a lot more angst or anger, if you will, on the other side, and the other side is more likely to come out in the midterm elections. In 2002, George W. Bush and the Republicans actually won seats when Bush was popular right after Afghanistan. The first time that's happened, a party in power won seats in the first midterm election since Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1934. My guess is that Joe Biden will lose about 39 seats. One thing Joe Biden does have going for him is the way that the seats have been gerrymandered. There are just so few seats that are actually competitive. And also, a lot of the moderate and conservative Democrats who were elected in 2018 on the Democratic wave ended up losing their re-election in 2020, meaning that there are just very few competitive Democratic seats out there. There's probably about 45 seats that are truly competitive right now. Most seats, the only way a Democrat or Republican will lose is not being either far left or far right enough. So the only way they could potentially lose would be in a primary. So I think that my guess is Biden probably loses about 39 seats in the House. In the Senate, though, it's interesting. I do think there's a chance that he maintains the Senate, simply because the Republicans in some cases are nominating weak candidates. I think Herschel Walker in Georgia, that would be a potential pickup, but he has a lot of vulnerabilities. I think that Raphael Warnock does have a chance at maintaining that seat. I think in Missouri, for example, if they nominate former Governor Creighton, who has a lot of vulnerabilities in terms of his family, I think there's in terms of there's some potential abuse in terms of his family. There's a possibility the Democrats could actually pick up that seat. So in the United States Senate, I'm not too sure that there's not going to be that much of a change of ballast over there. And you just look at you kind of go around the country, and there are certainly seats where I don't see where the Republicans have a lock on certainly a pickup seat for the Democrats this time around. Even New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan is ahead right now, but I expect that to kind of tighten as the Republicans actually choose a nominee for that seat in New Hampshire, which is very critical this year.
Let's talk about the January 6th committee and its impact. From watching it, I think it's one of the most un-American things I've ever seen in my life. I mean, that you have a prosecution with no defense witnesses, no cross-examination, no rules of evidence. If I feel this way, there's got to be a lot of other Americans out there who feel this way as well. What are your thoughts on that, Rich?
I think that there certainly are. I don't think that it actually has changed the trajectory of the feelings of the American people toward Donald Trump a little bit. Not to the fact that he wouldn't run again or anything like that, but there are some polls that show it's certainly tightening in the Republican primary right now. But I've also seen polls he's essentially tied right now with Joe Biden, assuming Joe Biden actually runs for re-election in 2024. Part of the problem in terms of the Republicans is they did not Kevin McCarthy did not essentially wanted to protest the hearings, so he did not try to put a Republican who was sympathetic to the president on the committee. So you had Adam Kinzinger from Illinois and Congresswoman Cheney from Wyoming, both who were antithetical to the president. But obviously, when you have 17 million people watching in prime time these hearings, it's going to have an effect on the president. And the president certainly has his own, the Truth social media network where he goes on and he tries to rebut all this. But it's not like he's on Twitter and he's doing this necessarily every single day. So it'd be very interesting to see what the actual reaction, if you go, right after the midterm elections, how much people remember this. And also, it's hard for me to see a scenario where Merrick Garland as a Democrat does not actually try to indict, try to go before the grand jury charges against the president. Certainly that would, imagine the effects that would have with him on the liberal intelligentsia. It'd be absolutely fascinating. But certainly the other thing this potentially has is for another Republican candidate, people that Republicans that are not necessarily Trumpicans or Trump Republicans might be looking at this scenario and saying, in 2024, do we really want to go through Donald Trump with all the baggage, with relitigating the 2020 elections, with seeing the footage of what had happened on January 6th, or do we want somebody fresh and somebody who's not necessarily going to have that baggage? And Donald Trump has to make the case that in 2024, that he's an actual, assuming he runs, that he's an actual candidate who can win, and that this will not have deleterious effects on his candidacy and on his ability to somehow appeal to people who aren't necessarily conservative Republicans.
You know, I agree with everything you said, Rich. I still hold to my point that it's completely un-American when you have two impeachments, a special prosecutor, special investigators, states attorneys general, local prosecutors, all investigating the former president of the United States, looking to come up with some kind of political or criminal charge. It sounds like we live in a banana republic. This is something that I expect of political opponents fighting each other, criminalizing and weaponizing the DOJ to destroy political opponents. It seems very un-American. I think if there was dirt on President Trump, it would have surfaced by now. Certainly Robert Mueller came up with a whole lot of nothing. The impeachment trials came up with a whole lot of nothing. And at the end of the day, it's always going to be a judgment call of could President Trump have done more to stop what happened on January 6th? That's one question. Two, does that riot rise to the offense of an insurrection? It certainly doesn't look like it. When I look at the closed circuit TV footage, it looks like a bunch of tourists mulling around, dressed up, holding signs, thinking they're having a good time. It didn't look like they were there to overthrow the government. What are your thoughts, Rich?
Well, I think the biggest problem Trump has potentially with those hearings is that, and this is what the committee was very good at, is that they did not have liberal Democrats testifying. They had Republicans. Now Trump's going to says obviously something to the effect of that they were very lower level or they're rhinos or whatnot, but they did have actual Republicans who actually worked in the Trump administration testifying against the former president. That's something, obviously, if there were Republicans, if there were Trump-type Republicans on the committee, that they would have done. They would have obviously tried to interview people that said that this was not what was going on, that Trump did try to stop it. But that's essentially what you saw in the hearings. So you have a lot of Republicans that are out there that are saying that no, that this is something that Donald Trump could have stopped. And I think also just the fact that Mike Pence is so involved with this in terms of people who have worked for Mike Pence, Mike Pence's aides, who said essentially that the president did not do anything once they started essentially saying that once the chance of Mike Pence essentially began, and the story is that Donald Trump afterwards said essentially that he was not going to go after him for that. So that's something that's going to be very interesting in 2024, and it's also interesting the way Mike Pence handles this, because Mike Pence has not excoriated Donald Trump specifically. He's saying when they ask him what his differences are with the president, he's saying something to the effect of, well, our difference right now is of focus. It's not necessarily of ideology. So Mike Pence has not completely disalligated himself or untethered himself, if you will, from the president right now. Now here's another scenario. If Donald Trump runs, is it possible that Mike Pence runs for president as well? A couple of months ago, I would have said no. Now I'm thinking of, well, he just endorsed a different candidate in Arizona with Donald Trump to see for governor's race, to see if this potentially could be some sort of a barometer. But there is certainly a scenario, if Donald Trump is not at 50% and there's 7 or 8 other Republicans running, even if some of them are, someone like Adam Kinzinger or Congresswoman Cheney, who are certainly not Donald Trump Republicans, and I can see a scenario where he actually does get into the race and tries to run kind of his own campaign. He's just like, by the way, is there any precedent for that? Yes, 1940, Franklin D. Roosevelt going for a 3rd term, his own incumbent vice president at the time, John Nance Garner, actually declared his candidacy at the convention that year. So it's very possible.
And is that in the trivia book?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Also the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, James Farley, and a postmaster general from Franklin Roosevelt, also challenged him at the convention that year, believe it or not.
I do believe it. If it's in the book, I believe it. I love your book, The Great American Political Trivia Challenge by Rich Rubino. Rich, I'm going to grill you on a few more questions.
Okay.
Let's say you are the CEO. No, let's say you hold the controlling share of stock in a Fortune 500 company, and it's
Yes.
up to you to pick a CEO for the company. Are you looking at a group of men who are nearly 80 years of age? I mean, that's the thing. If we have a Trump-Biden matchup, we're going to have a man who's nearly 80 facing off against a man who is 80. Not to be ageist at all, other than being very polite, perhaps genteel people and maybe well-preserved. I don't know any 80-year-olds who are at the top of their game. What are your thoughts?
Well, there is a reason the retirement age is certainly a lot younger than 80 right now, and that it's obviously politics. Politics is just so different than anything else. People don't want people with experience. They want people who are new to the field, and they don't mind the fact that people can essentially, it's not only at the presidency, by the way. I mean, Nancy Pelosi is 82, Mitch McConnell, Chuck Schumer. These are not, there are a lot of gray beards, if you will, that are essentially running both branches of government. You can go to Steny Hoyer, you can go to Jim Clyburn. The whole Democratic leadership right now is over 80. Go on the Republican side, Chuck Grassley's 88 years old, and he's running for re-election in the state of Iowa right now to another 6-year term. Strom Thurmond, literally, who ran for president in 1948, was still in the United States Senate in 2002 at 100 years old. Robert Byrd was 94 years old. You go to Ted Kennedy. Age is so much different in terms of American politics, in terms of what people value. Now, that being said, if it's in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives, obviously it could be an advantage because you kind of know how to get the legislation through. You know how to do constituent service. Now, at the presidency, though, I think that if you look at the polls, majority of both Republicans and Democrats want somebody other than Joe Biden as a nominee, somebody other than Donald Trump as a nominee. And I can really see a scenario, whether Joe Biden runs or does not run. If he does not run, obviously you're going to get someone a lot younger. If he does run, you're going to see a scenario where I think he's going to have a major primary challenge, the way that Jimmy Carter had with Ted Kennedy and Jerry Brown in 1976, or Gerald Ford had with Ronald Reagan in 1976, which obviously divides the party, and then the candidate in the general election does not garner as much support. On the Republican side, if Donald Trump does run, I think he is vulnerable. I think the January 6th hearings have certainly showed that. And if I'm a Republican running against Donald Trump, my case, I don't say directly anything about his age. The case that I make is, you have all these vulnerabilities. This is what the Democrats can point at you. Why not choose somebody who wasn't involved with January 6th, somebody who's kind of a fresh face, if you will? Now, that being said, there's a way that hurts you if I think that you can be seen as presumptuous. I remember Eric Swalwell running for president in 2016, running for president in 2019. He dropped out before 2020, and he always talked about generational change. And the American people weren't just looking for generational change because he didn't really necessarily stand out from the other candidates. They're also looking for somebody who has some sort of new ideas or different ideas. But here's an interesting thing about the Democratic Party last time around. Pete Buttigieg, who was under 40 years old, garnered almost no support from his own generation. I think part of that younger voters did not see Pete Buttigieg as kind of an advocate for them. They saw him almost as the son that every 80-year-old would want, kind of very polite, religious. He wasn't necessarily their candidate. Bernie Sanders, who was well over 70 years old, did better with that constituency than any other candidate. And Pete Buttigieg, the youngest candidate, did better with the older voters. So don't think that just because, and this goes back to Eric Swalwell, that just because somebody is of a certain age, that means the candidates of that age are going to go with them. They are looking for ideology. They are looking for vigor. They're looking for a lot of other things. But that being said, I think that the American people right now would like candidates other than Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
You want to hear the prediction for 2024, who the two major candidates will be?
Yes.
Here we go. Infamously, I
have an idea what you're going to say.
2016. So 2024, it's going to be the California governor, Gavin Newsom, versus the Florida governor, Ron Desantis. What do you think of that matchup?
First of all, Ron DeSantis, and a lot of people aren't talking about this, he's very vulnerable for re-election right now. Charlie Crist and Nikki Fried are the two candidates in the primary running against him. Now, the polls have been everywhere in this, but there are some polls that show the race essentially even right now. So if that's the case, first of all, Florida is very much a showdown or a swing state. There is a possibility that could happen the way just what happened to Jeb Bush in '94. The thought was Jeb Bush was going to run for governor in 1994. He was going to get elected, then he'd get reelected in '98. Then by 2000, he was going to be the Republican nominee. It turned out losing to Lawton Chiles. I think there is at least a 40% chance right now that he, and I'm really going on a limb here, that Ron DeSantis is not reelected in the state of Florida right now. Part of it is, I think his presidential ambitions, I think, are hurting him because he's seen as more of a national figure, and this is what Charlie Crist, assuming he's the Democratic nominee, is going to come over. He's going to say, this is what I would say to him in a debate. I would say, I'm agreeing that I'm going to serve out my entire term as governor of Florida. My question, Governor DeSantis, if you get reelected and you start running for president, you're going to be spending basically a lot of time out of the state running for president. Why should the Florida taxpayers have to pay for you to spend all this money, to spend all this time out of state? Now, if he's ahead by 10 points, he can say, well, I'm running for governor right now and not have to worry about it. But if he gets to the point where it's so vulnerable, he's going to have to say something to the effect of, yes, I agree to serve out my full term. Now, you can get out of that pledge. Bill Clinton did it. 1990, he said, you bet, in a debate with Sheffield Nelson for governor of Arkansas. Then he went on a listening tour after the legislative session and said the people of Arkansas think that I should run for president. And he went, got out of that. But I do think that Ron DeSantis should not put his cart before the horse here. He has to get reelected first right now, and reelected is certainly not a sure thing. Now, if he does get reelected, and if he gets reelected overwhelmingly, then assuming if Donald Trump is not run, he is certainly the preponderant front runner. Now, that being said, he has not been on a national stage running for office, so we'll see essentially how he does in that avenue. On the Democratic side, Gavin Newsom, it's interesting. He just survived a recall last year against Republican Larry Elder, and that certainly benefited him. But the question I would have for Gary Newsom is, can you run the biggest state in the country and still spend 2 years running for president? That's got to be a pretty hard thing to do, to spend all your time. When you're running for president, you have to run for primaries, then the general election. So you have to have on one hand, you have the state that, goes all the way from, essentially, if it was on the East Coast, it would go from about Florida, probably way up there, maybe even to Pennsylvania. How are you going to govern the biggest state in the country and also be a presidential candidate for 2 years? Jerry Brown tried it in 78, tried it in 76, tried it in 1980, certainly, but it's going to be very hard. In terms of who the Democratic nominees are, I would just say some possibilities. One of them would be Congressman Ro Khanna from California, that's kind of seen as a potential Joe Biden challenger. I'd also look to Ray Cooper, the governor of North Carolina. Problem he's got is he's the governor of North Carolina, and there's a Republican lieutenant governor. So every time he steps out of the state, the Republican lieutenant governor takes over. Mitch Landrieu, the former mayor of New Orleans, is somebody I certainly would look at. Kamala Harris, I do not see where her natural constituency is right now. And there is some talk, and I haven't heard it from her herself, but some pollsters think that Hillary Clinton is somehow going to come back. The problem with Hillary Clinton is there's a lot of angst that she effectuates from the left wing of the party, and we certainly saw that when Bernie Sanders almost upended her in 2016. And my guess is, by the way, there's going to be one candidate on both the Republican side and the Democratic side that nobody is talking about right now, that's going to see the opportunity the way Jimmy Carter did in 76, the way Barack Obama did in 2008, get in there, and is probably going to make some waves as well.
Get the popcorn ready, buckle your seatbelt, get the yoo-hoo out, get a couple of straws, get ready to watch. It's going to be an exciting race for the next 2 years. And we will be talking more to the man behind the book, The Great American Political Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids, Rich Rubino. Rich Rubino, thank you so much for joining us here today on The Right Way.
Thank you so much, Logan. I greatly enjoyed it.
I did as well. And until next time, I'm Logan Crawford.